My name is Laura Mitchell, and I am 32 years old. I had just finished the most grueling 4 years of my life. I worked 12-hour night shifts in the ICU, studied in the few hours I had left, and kept myself afloat without a single dime from my family. Every bill, every textbook, every cup of cheap coffee that kept me awake at 3 in the morning was paid for by me. I thought maybe, just maybe, they had finally decided to acknowledge what I had accomplished when they invited me over for a graduation party. That alone was unusual. Growing up, my mother Debbie rarely hosted anything for me. She would make excuses about money being tight or about me not needing attention. But she would throw elaborate birthday parties for my younger half-brother Tyler, spend hundreds on decorations, and beam at him like he hung the moon. As for Frank, my stepfather, the man who had been in my life since I was 13, I had learned early on to stay out of his way. He had a temper, one that could turn physical, and a knack for making you feel like you were worthless without raising his voice. And yet that day, as I pulled into their driveway and saw balloons on the porch, I let myself feel something I had trained myself to avoid: hope. The living room was done up in blue and silver, with a giant "Congratulations, Laura" banner hanging above the fireplace. Neighbors were there, a few of my mother's church friends, and even people I had never seen before. Debbie hugged me when I walked in. For a second, it felt real. Frank handed me a glass of champagne and told me he was proud. Tyler sat in the corner on his phone, not even looking up, but I told myself I would not let that bother me. For once, the attention was on me. There was food laid out on real plates, not paper ones. A cake box sat on the dining table, the kind that comes from an actual bakery, not the grocery store clearance rack. Debbie told me to sit down, said they had a surprise. Frank carried the cake over like it was a treasure. Everyone gathered around. He set it in front of me and nodded for me to open the lid. I smiled, thinking this was one of those rare moments where my family would show they were proud, that maybe all those nights I had driven home from work with tears in my eyes had been worth it. I lifted the lid, and there it was. Written in looping red icing were the words "Congratulations, loser." My first reaction was confusion. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they had mixed up orders. But then Frank laughed. A deep, genuine belly laugh, like he had just told the funniest joke of his life. Debbie covered her mouth, trying to hold in her giggles. Tyler looked up from his phone and smirked, shaking his head like he could barely believe how funny it was. My chest felt hollow. The room seemed to tilt slightly as my heart pounded in my ears. Some guests gave awkward glances to each other, but no one spoke. No one said this was wrong. No one defended me. No one. That was when I knew this was not just about a cake. This was them telling me in front of everyone exactly how little I meant to them. I forced a smile, lifted my glass, and said smoothly to my family for always being exactly who I thought you were. The laughter died almost instantly. I held their eyes, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, then added, "And to the future, because now I finally know exactly how to treat you the way you have always treated me." I drank, set the glass down, picked up my bag, and walked toward the door. Frank muttered something about me being dramatic. Tyler rolled his eyes. I stopped at the doorway, looked back at them, and said, "Oh, and one more thing, you will figure it out soon enough." Then I left. No yelling, no tears, just a clean break. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew something they did not. This was not the kind of insult I would let slide. This was the final straw. And before the night was over, I would make sure they never had the chance to humiliate me like that again. From the outside, people might think my family is just another ordinary working-class bunch in a small Midwestern town. But the truth is far darker and far more calculated. Frank has been in my life since I was 13 years old, and from day one, he set the tone that I was an outsider in my own home. His temper was something you could feel before you saw it. The way he slammed a cupboard door or tightened his jaw was enough to make you freeze. He never hit me in front of my mother, but when she was out of the house, he would find small ways to remind me that he could. A shove against the wall for answering back. A grip on my wrist so tight it left bruises because I was not moving fast enough. When I finally told Debbie about it, she accused me of exaggerating and said Frank had a hard time showing affection. She said I should be grateful he provided a roof over my head. I was 13 years old, hearing my own mother justify a man putting his hands on me. Tyler was only 8 at the time, but he quickly learned he could do no wrong. If he broke something, Frank would blame me for not watching him. If he failed a class, Debbie would say the teacher was unfair. Over the years, it became a pattern. Tyler got cars he never paid for, trips he never earned, and bail money he did not deserve. I got nothing except responsibility for everyone else's mess. The stakes for me have always been high, but the difference now is that I am no longer a powerless teenager. I have worked for everything I have, and I have built a life on my own terms. If I let them get away with humiliating me again, I am not just letting them insult me in front of a room of people. I am telling them they can keep taking from me without consequence. And they have been taking in more ways than one. Last year, I was injured on a night shift when a patient lashed out during a seizure. I tore a ligament in my shoulder and had to take 2 weeks off work. The hospital's insurance paid a small settlement to cover lost wages. Before the check even cleared, Frank had suggested that I invest in helping Tyler get back on his feet. Debbie told me it was the right thing to do for family. When I refused, they stopped speaking to me for 3 weeks. Then there is the matter of my credit. Because I have always been careful with money, my score is excellent. I learned 2 months ago that Frank had tried to open a line of credit using my social security number. The application was flagged because the address did not match mine. When I confronted him, he laughed and said he was only trying to help me build more credit history. Debbie defended him again, saying it was just a misunderstanding. That was the moment I started quietly pulling my financial life out of their reach. I changed my bank account passwords, closed the joint savings account Debbie had convinced me to open years ago, and had my credit reports locked. But I did not tell them. I wanted them to believe they still had access because I knew sooner or later they would try to use it against me, and when they did, I would be ready. The emotional stakes are just as high as the financial ones. Every time I allowed them to brush off something hurtful they did, it told the 13-year-old inside me that she was still powerless. Every time I loaned them money without asking for it back, it reinforced their belief that I owed them. Every time I stayed quiet when Frank's temper flared, it was another layer of silence pressed down over my voice. This cake stunt was not a harmless joke. It was a calculated reminder of where they think I belong. If I let it go, I am signing up for another decade of being the family's unpaid bank account emotional punching bag and scapegoat. If I push back, I know it will not be without fallout. Frank will get meaner. Debbie will play the victim to anyone who will listen. Tyler will smear my name to our relatives. But there is something they have not realized yet. I am no longer afraid of them. I have my own place, my own income, my own future. They can no longer dangle a roof over my head or threaten to kick me out. They can no longer make me believe that their version of family is the only one I get. The stakes now are about reclaiming my life entirely. If I do this right, I can cut off their ability to manipulate me financially and emotionally, and force them to face their own mess without me cleaning it up. And maybe that will finally be the wake-up call they deserve. Or maybe it will just destroy whatever is left between us. Either way, I can live with it. What I cannot live with is walking back into that house someday and letting them pretend that cake was just a joke. When I think back on my childhood, it is like watching a movie where you already know the villain wins every time. Frank came into our lives when I was in middle school, and from the start, he positioned himself as the authority over everything from what I ate to who I spoke to after school. He was charming when other people were around, but the second the door closed, he became something else entirely. He had this way of making you feel small without ever raising his voice. A sarcastic comment about how I looked tired when I had been up all night studying. A remark about how I was lucky to live under his roof when I worked every summer to buy my own clothes. Debbie, my mother, enabled it all. She would roll her eyes if I complained and tell me Frank was just old-fashioned and that I needed to respect him. Respect was a one-way street in that house. Then there was Tyler. When he was little, he followed me around like a shadow. But as soon as he realized Frank would back him no matter what he did, he started to see me not as his sister, but as someone he could use. If he forgot his homework, I would be told to do it for him. If he dented Frank's truck, I would be told to take the blame because Tyler already has enough on his plate. One summer when I was 15, I had saved up to buy a secondhand laptop for school. A week later, Tyler spilled soda on it while playing games, and Frank said it was my fault for not keeping my stuff out of the way. There were hundreds of moments like that. Times when I tried to set a boundary and was told I was being selfish. Times when I achieved something and it was brushed aside because Tyler needed attention that day. By the time I was in high school, I stopped expecting them to show up for me. I got into the Honor Society without them attending the ceremony. I made the varsity track team, and they did not come to a single meet. But if Tyler had a football game, the whole household revolved around it. Debbie would spend hours making snacks for his teammates, and Frank would stand on the sidelines, yelling like his life depended on it. The financial manipulation started when I got my first job at 16. Debbie would ask to borrow $20 for gas and never pay it back. Frank would hint that I should contribute to the grocery bill because I was eating like an adult now. At 17, when I got into my first choice nursing program, they acted like it was an inconvenience. Debbie said she could not help with tuition, and Frank told me I should probably just work full-time instead of wasting money on school. Meanwhile, Tyler failed 2 classes his senior year, and they hired a private tutor without blinking. The toxicity was not always loud. Sometimes it was the silence after I shared good news. Sometimes it was the way they would look at each other across the table, like I had said something ridiculous. As an adult, I have come to understand that these small cuts are what really wear you down. They teach you to expect nothing so you will not be disappointed. They convince you that you are not worth celebrating. And when something genuinely cruel happens like that cake, you almost believe it is your fault for thinking it could have been different. But looking back now, I see the pattern clearly. Frank's control was about power. Debbie's defense of him was about avoiding conflict at any cost. Tyler's entitlement was the product of both. Together, they created an environment where my role was to be the dependable one, the fixer, the person who kept things running while they took what they wanted. That is the root of the darkness in this family. It is not one big dramatic blow-up. It is a lifetime of calculated small abuses that add up until you forget what normal is supposed to look like. And that is why this time I cannot just let it slide. This is not about one insult on a cake. This is about decades of being diminished in my own home. This is about finally deciding I am not going to be the background character in their story anymore. The first sign that something bigger was happening came 2 weeks before the party. When I overheard Debbie on the phone in the kitchen, she was talking to someone from an apartment complex in another state, laughing in that fake sweet voice she used when she wanted something. She said Tyler would be moving there in the fall for school, and that the lease was already secured thanks to me. I froze in the hallway, my mind trying to make sense of what I had just heard. I had never agreed to co-sign anything for Tyler. Later that night, Debbie casually mentioned it over dinner like it was no big deal. Frank jumped in to say it was just a formality and would not cost me anything. I wanted to say no, but the weight of years of conditioning kept me quiet. It was the same way they had gotten me to cover for Tyler's unpaid speeding tickets last year, and the same way they had convinced me to give them my car for a month when Frank's truck was in the shop. But this time something felt different. I had just gotten a raise at work and had finally built up a small savings account. I knew if I let them tie my name to Tyler's lease, they would find a way to turn it into my problem. Around the same time, I noticed Frank hanging around my car more than usual, asking questions about my insurance and acting interested in its mileage. Then one evening, I caught him on the phone, describing the make and model to someone, and saying he might be able to get it cheap. That was when I realized he was planning to sell it behind my back, like he had done with my bike when I was 17. The pieces started coming together like a bad crime drama. Debbie talking about my extra money to her church friends, Tyler bragging to one of his buddies that he was getting a new gaming setup even though he had no job, Frank making not-so-subtle comments about how young women waste money on rent when they could just live with family. They were circling, waiting for the right moment to take what they wanted. I started paying closer attention to their movements and found out Tyler's tuition had already been partially paid with funds from an account I had set up years ago to pay off my own student loans. The account had been dormant since I finished paying them off, but Debbie still had the old information and somehow managed to access it. She probably thought I would never notice. That week, I began quietly documenting everything. I saved screenshots of text messages where Debbie referred to my savings as family resources. I photographed a note Frank had left on the counter with my bank account number scribbled on it. I even recorded a conversation where Tyler admitted he knew I would cover for him if things went south. Every little piece felt like another nail in the coffin of whatever relationship we had left. I was done being blindsided. I was done finding out about their plans only after they had already put my name on something. The more I uncovered, the more it felt like a thriller I could not turn off each day, revealing another layer of manipulation. By the time the night of the party arrived, I was no longer just suspicious. I was certain that they were already counting on my help for Tyler's move his tuition, and probably another one of Frank's get-rich-quick schemes. What they did not know was that I had already decided none of it was going to happen. They thought I was walking into that party naive and hopeful. In reality, I was walking in with my eyes wide open, ready to watch them make the mistake that would give me the perfect excuse to burn the last bridge between us. The night of the party began like a scene from someone else's life. I walked into the living room, and for a moment I almost believed the decorations and the warm greetings. Debbie hugged me, telling me how proud she was, and Frank handed me a glass of champagne like we were some normal family celebrating a milestone. Guests smiled and congratulated me. Tyler was off to the side, scrolling his phone, barely acknowledging my existence, but I told myself not to care. For once, I was supposed to be the center of attention. People made small talk about my job, asked about my plans for the future, and I let myself feel a flicker of pride. It was fragile, but it was there. Then Frank announced it was time for the cake. Debbie disappeared into the kitchen and came back carrying a large white bakery box, the kind that makes you think of something expensive and custom ordered. She set it in front of me with a big smile. Frank nodded at me, telling me to open it. I remember feeling a strange mix of anticipation and suspicion. Part of me still wanted this to be genuine, but another part braced for the punchline. I lifted the lid. There, in bright red icing perfectly centered, were the words, "Congratulations, loser." My heart dropped into my stomach. For a second, I thought maybe I was reading it wrong. Maybe it was some weird inside joke I had forgotten about. Then Frank laughed that loud, unrestrained laugh that told me he was proud of himself. Debbie tried to hide her giggle behind her hand, but her shoulders were shaking. Tyler looked up from his phone and grinned like he had just won something. The room seemed to close in on me. A couple of guests glanced at each other uncomfortably, but no one said anything. No one told them to stop. No one defended me. It was like every moment from my childhood when I had been humiliated or ignored replaying all at once in my head. The years of being the one they could rely on but never celebrate. The bruises I had hidden, the insults I had swallowed, the money I had handed over without thanks. It all piled up in that instant. I realized they had never intended this to be a moment of recognition. This was a performance for their own amusement, a reminder that no matter what I achieved, I would always be beneath them in their eyes. Something in me went still. Not angry, not sad, just cold and clear. I picked up my champagne glass and stood slowly. The room quieted as people turned to watch me. I looked directly at Debbie, then Frank, and finally Tyler. "For always being exactly who I thought you were," I said evenly. The laughter stopped. I nodded toward the decorations and the cake. So much effort, so much thought, I will never forget it. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, then lifted my glass a little higher. And to the future, because now I finally know exactly how to treat you, the way you have always treated me. I took a slow drink, set the glass down, and picked up my bag. As I walked toward the door, Frank muttered something about me being dramatic. Tyler smirked without looking up from his phone. I stopped at the threshold and turned back, meeting Frank's eyes. "Oh, and one more thing," I said quietly. "You will figure it out soon enough." Then I stepped outside into the cool night air. My hands were steady, my heartbeat calm. I knew what I had to do, and I knew exactly when I was going to do it. That cake was not just an insult. It was permission. Permission for me to finally stop playing the role they had assigned me. Permission to make them feel the kind of helplessness they had made me live with for years. As I walked to my car, I could still hear the faint sound of music and laughter from inside, but it already felt distant, like it belonged to another life. I did not go home right away after the party. Instead, I drove to the all-night diner near the hospital where I work. The place was almost empty except for a couple of truckers at the counter and a waitress who knew me by name. I ordered coffee and sat in the corner booth staring out the window while the plan formed in my mind. It was not enough to walk away this time. I needed to make sure they could never use me again. I thought about calling my friend Marcy, who works in the ER with me. She has been through her own battles with a toxic family, and once told me that the best thing she ever did was cut off their access to her completely. I sent her a quick text asking if she was awake. She replied within minutes, and I told her about the cake. She did not even sound surprised. She reminded me of something she had said before, that people like Frank and Debbie only stop when you make it impossible for them to continue. Then she suggested I talk to a lawyer she knew who specialized in both financial abuse and domestic violence cases. The next day, I met the lawyer, a sharp woman named Andrea, who listened without interrupting as I explained everything from the CO-signed lease to the attempted credit fraud to the settlement money they had tried to take. She nodded slowly and said I had more leverage than I realized. The first thing she told me to do was close any account they could possibly access, change all my passwords, and put a freeze on my credit with all 3 bureaus. Then she advised me to start compiling every piece of evidence I had. Old text messages where Debbie referred to my savings as hers, the note with my bank account number in Frank's handwriting, even Tyler's casual comments about me bailing him out. She said with enough documentation I could not only protect myself, but potentially press charges if they tried to retaliate. Andrea also pointed out something I had not considered. If Frank had ever laid hands on me and there was any proof even from years ago, it could still be used to establish a pattern of abuse. That could strengthen any case I might need to make later. I thought about the time I ended up in urgent care at 15 with a sprained wrist after Frank shoved me into a door. Debbie told the nurse I had slipped on the stairs. I had believed that file was long gone, but Andrea said hospitals keep records for decades. I left her office with a list of steps to take and a sense of control I had not felt in years. That night, I started locking everything down. I closed the old savings account Debbie had drained before. I froze my credit. I changed every password twice. I pulled copies of my credit reports and flagged the suspicious inquiries. By the time I was done, I knew they could not touch a single thing I owned without my permission. But I also knew I would not give them the courtesy of a warning. I wanted them to find out the hard way, to feel the shock of losing the access they had taken for granted. I wanted them to look at each other in confusion and realize I was no longer the easy mark I used to be. The first move I made was the most obvious and the most immediate. I called the apartment complex Tyler was supposed to move into and told the leasing manager I was withdrawing as co-signer. She sounded surprised and said the lease paperwork was already in process. I told her firmly that my signature would not be on anything, and if they proceeded without my approval, they would be violating the law. She paused, then said she understood and would remove my name immediately. I hung up feeling a surge of relief. That was one chain cut. Next, I contacted the registrar's office at the college Tyler claimed he was attending. I asked about the status of his tuition payment. They told me a partial payment had been made, but the remainder was due in 3 weeks, or his enrollment would be canceled. I knew that remaining balance was what Debbie expected me to cover. I made sure they understood I would not be paying it and asked if there was a way to retract any payment tied to my account. There was, and I did. That was chain number 2. The third move required more patience. I spent 2 evenings compiling all the evidence I had gathered over the years. Photos of bruises, text messages hinting at financial manipulation, bank statements showing unexplained withdrawals. I put it all into a secure folder and sent copies to Andrea. She replied within an hour saying this was more than enough to take action if needed. She also suggested I submit a police report documenting the credit fraud attempt by Frank. I did that the next morning. By the end of the week, I had severed every known financial tie they could use against me. The only thing left was to wait. I knew it would take them a little while to notice. They were so sure I would keep cleaning up their messes that they would not suspect anything until the walls started closing in. That moment came faster than I expected. 5 days after the party, Debbie left me a voicemail saying there was some kind of issue with Tyler's lease and asking me to call her. I ignored it. The next day, Tyler sent a text that just said, "Dude, what the hell did you do?" I ignored that too. Then Frank called and left a message full of anger about how I had embarrassed the family and needed to fix it immediately. I let them stew. A week later, the messages turned more frantic. Debbie's voice cracked when she said the landlord told Tyler he no longer had a co-signer, and the school was threatening to cancel his enrollment. Tyler's texts went from casual swearing to outright demands. Still, I said nothing. I wanted them to feel the same helplessness I had felt for years, whenever they decided something for me, without asking. 2 weeks after the party, Frank called again this time, trying to use guilt instead of anger. He said family sticks together, and that I was being selfish. I laughed out loud alone in my apartment when I heard that. Selfish was refusing to sacrifice my credit for a grown man who had never paid his own rent. Selfish was keeping my own money instead of letting them drain it for another one of Tyler's second chances. On day 22, I finally picked up when Frank called. He launched straight into yelling about how I had ruined Tyler's future. I let him go on until he ran out of steam. Then I said calmly, "I do not think I will be fixing this." Silence. He sputtered something about responsibility and being an adult. I told him being an adult meant handling the consequences of your own choices. Then I hung up. Debbie tried next with her soft voice routine, saying I was punishing everyone over a joke. I told her I was finally treating them the way they had always treated me. She gasped like the words had actually hurt. I did not care. The counterattack was complete. They no longer had access to my finances, my credit, or my goodwill. And for the first time, I felt like I had control over my own life. 3 weeks after the party, the cracks in their carefully constructed world began to split wide open. Tyler called me 5 times in a row one Friday night until I finally answered just to hear the desperation in his voice. He went straight into shouting about how the school had dropped his enrollment because the tuition deadline passed without full payment. His voice broke when he admitted he had already told everyone he was moving out of state, and now he had nowhere to go. I told him he would have to figure it out the same way I always had. He hung up on me. The next day, Debbie left me a long voicemail, half sobbing, half accusing, saying Tyler was forced to pack up his things and move back into their house and that it was humiliating for them. She tried to say they had only wanted to help him get a fresh start and that I had ruined it. I deleted the message without responding. Then Frank's problems started. The bank called to verify suspicious activity on a loan application he had submitted using my personal information. Only this time the account was frozen and flagged, triggering an investigation. He showed up at my apartment building, banging on the door, yelling for me to come out and talk. I called the police. By the time they arrived, he had left, but I filed a harassment report on the spot. 2 days later, Andrea called to tell me the police had contacted her about Frank's history, and that another woman, a former girlfriend from before he met my mother, had come forward with her own accusations of physical abuse. That meant the case against him was no longer just about financial fraud, but also about a potential pattern of domestic violence. Debbie tried to do damage control by calling me late at night and saying Frank was just under stress and that I should help the family get through this. I told her she could help herself by hiring a lawyer. Word spread quickly in their small community. Debbie stopped showing up to her church group because people were whispering about the police report. Tyler's friends stopped hanging around after finding out he was living at home with no job and no school to go to. Even the relatives who usually took their side started calling me privately to ask what had really happened. I told them the truth without embellishment and let them draw their own conclusions. The fallout hit fast. Frank's loan applications were denied across the board. Debbie had to cancel a vacation she had been bragging about for months because their finances were suddenly stretched thin. Tyler picked up a part-time job at a hardware store, but lasted less than 2 weeks before quitting. None of them would admit outright that I was the cause of their sudden collapse, but the timing spoke for itself. For years, they had taken my money, my credit, my time, and my silence. Now they had to survive without any of it, and they were failing. Watching it happen did not feel like revenge in the dramatic movie sense. It felt like balance, like the scales had finally tipped back to where they should have been all along. They were finally experiencing the reality they had shielded each other from at my expense. And the best part was that I did not have to lift a finger anymore. All I had to do was nothing, and that nothing was destroying the foundation they had built on using me. By the time a month had passed since the party, I was waking up each morning with a sense of lightness I could barely recognize. My phone was quiet now except for the occasional spam call. The constant buzzing of demands and guilt trips had stopped. I had moved into a small one-bedroom apartment closer to the hospital, a place with big windows that let the morning sun spill across the hardwood floors. I bought a secondhand couch and a bookshelf, things I chose for myself without anyone's opinion or judgment. The first weekend there, I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee and realized it was the first time in years I could hear my own thoughts without the weight of their voices crowding them out. I started picking up extra shifts at work, not because I needed the money for someone else's crisis, but because I wanted to pad my savings for my own goals. I joined a yoga class on Saturday mornings and began cooking real meals instead of living off vending machine snacks. Slowly, the exhaustion that had clung to me for years began to fade. I found myself laughing more at work, staying after my shift to chat with colleagues, even making plans to visit a friend in another state. The absence of my family's chaos created space for something I had not felt since I was a kid possibility. I kept in touch with Andrea not because I expected to need her, but because she reminded me that protecting myself was not selfish. She encouraged me to keep documenting any attempts they might make to contact me, but weeks went by with nothing significant. I think they finally realized that the old version of me, the one who would bend over backward to keep them comfortable, was gone. In her place was someone who valued her own peace over their approval. I stopped checking their social media. I stopped asking my aunt for updates. The less I knew about their lives, the more I felt in control of mine. This was not about revenge anymore. It was about choosing myself every single day and not apologizing for it. I knew there would always be people who thought I was wrong for cutting off my family people, who believed blood ties should outweigh everything else. But those people had never lived in my shoes. They had never opened a cake box to find an insult staring back at them, while the people who were supposed to love them laughed. They had never spent years being used like an ATM with a heartbeat. I had, and I had survived it. Now I was more than surviving. I was living. One quiet Sunday evening, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink low over the city skyline. The air was warm and still, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt completely at ease. My thoughts drifted back to that night of the party, to the moment I lifted the lid of the cake box and saw those words in red icing. "Congratulations, loser." Back then, it had felt like a punch to the gut, the final confirmation that my family would never truly value me. Now it felt different. In a way, they had been right. I was a loser, but not in the way they meant. I had lost the role they forced on me, the endless cycle of saying yes when I wanted to say no, the constant pressure to be the safety net for people who never caught me when I fell. I had lost the need to prove myself to them, and the illusion that they would ever change. And in losing all of that, I had won something far greater. I had won my freedom. I thought about all the times they had told me we are family, as if that phrase excused every cruel thing they did. The truth is, family is not defined by shared blood or last names. It is defined by trust, respect, and care. Without those things, it is just a group of people connected by paperwork. If anyone listening to my story has felt the way I used to feel, small and invisible in your own home, I want you to know you do not have to keep living that way. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to walk away. And you are allowed to build a life that feels safe and whole, even if the people you leave behind call you selfish or bitter. They will say those things because your absence forces them to face the truth about themselves. Let them. I finished my tea, feeling the last traces of daylight fade. Somewhere out there, Frank was probably blaming me for his financial troubles. Debbie was telling herself she had done her best, and Tyler was still convinced the world owed him something. None of that was my problem anymore. I went inside and closed the balcony door, locking it with a quiet click. That sound felt like closure. The cake had been their final insult. My silence had been my answer, and now the rest of my life was mine to decide.